I think there's a fundamental problem with the way that we understand security, especially national security. There has come to be these two compartmentalized, neatly labeled categories of things. One which we call security, which includes defense systems, borders with barbed wires, armies facing off each other, interpersonal violence, community hatred, military industrial complexes, historical entrenchment, geopolitical factors that cause two armies or groups of people to go to war against each other with weapons and with arms. And the other category is this neat, peaceful set of non-security issues, which includes, art and culture and cinema and industrialization, urbanization, innovation, development sectors like agriculture, like nutrition, like poverty, and most of all climate change. Now these are issues that are not security issues. These are the peacetime issues that we must, as nations and as the international system, deal with separately. But at the root of the argument that I'm going to make to you today is actually something that the Bulletin of Economic Scientists determined in the year 2007. They did something very interesting. You've all heard of the Doomsday Clock. Now, the Doomsday Clock it's a clock. It's an abstract thought device that is maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And the Doomsday Clock really is a way to measure how close humanity is to a human-made catastrophic event. So the way it works is the closer that the clock gets to midnight determines how close we are to a catastrophic event of our own making. And for the longest time, ever since the Doomsday Clock was set up, the determining factor happened to be nuclear war, how close we were to the nuclear brink, to two nations facing off in a WMD-oriented conflict, and how close we were to using the weapons of mass destruction in our arsenal. But something very interesting happened in the year 2007, and that is the atomic scientists determined that there was one other big catastrophic risk that they had to take into account in determining how close we were to midnight. And that risk was climate change. I think if there's anything that this year, the year of the COVID-19 pandemic, has made abundantly clear to us, is that the planet is no longer an abstract idea. The planet doesn't exist outside of us. It's not something that we only think about when looking at a world map, or in some moralistic John Lennonist idea of thinking of ourselves as one community. That the living environment we inhabit, the ecosystems we live in, are very much determinant of our day-to-day lives. They very much determine how healthy we are, how safe we are. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that it's not just security threats that bring nations to a standstill and that shut down our borders with each other. That what really can shut down economies and close our borders to each other are also environmental things, like a pandemic that has come to us from wildlife. It has taught us that to really secure populations, that to really secure the citizenry of a country, we are going to have to course correct with nature, and just buying the biggest aircraft carrier is no longer enough. So I want to talk to you today about expanding our idea of security, specifically biodefense, which has traditionally been understood as defense against biological WMD. So I'm going to argue to you that biodefense, understood as something called Biodefense 2.0, needs to be understood as a framework that allows us to see the climate change as a security threat, and that allows us to see natural ecosystems and the building of defenses of our world through the nurturing of our planet as security systems, as defense systems for our world. I want you to see climate action as a defense strategy that nations and the international community must start thinking of deploying, because all of our future risks, the way I understand them, are related to the climate, and most of our security work, therefore, in the future needs to take the climate into account. And it's not just me. In the year 2001, a major medical journal, Lancet, actually referred to climate change as a new form of bioterrorism. So, the moment we start talking about biodefense as a little bit more than our security against WMD, the minute we start talking about defense and security as a little bit more than protecting our borders and really take into account climate change, you know what happens? You know what happens when we start putting a security lens on the planet? I think what happens is that we begin to focus then more on science. I think maybe you can afford to be a climate science denier, someone who thinks that climate change isn't happening and global warming is very far away, if you're the kind of person that thinks that climate change is just polar bears floating off on an iceberg, or this abstract idea that the planet is getting hotter and that it will get hotter in the future, of course those two are of course the big they are important issues. Endangered species are critical, and the heating of the planet is really the end game of this conversation, as it were. But can you still afford to deny climate science as a person once you start understanding climate change not as just the survival of a polar bear, but really as a vector for poverty? Once you start understanding it as environmental degradation, as soil degradation, as food insecurity, as something that impacts the livelihood of coastal communities, once you start understanding the climate and our planet, environmental degradation as a vector for conflict, for civil war, that are not just as simple to say as two ethnicities fighting each other, but really are a factor of the political economy that climate change produces, that puts people into a situation of deprivation from which they can scarcely emerge unless they have weapons in their hands. Once you start understanding, the planet as a vector for poverty, of inequality, once you start understanding climate change as a non-state actor, as a belligerent, as a weapon of mass destruction in terms of its impact on war and its fallouts on war. And the reason I'm doing this is not, just in terms of coming up with a new concept for us to understand these things. Let's look at a few definitions. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 describes a biological weapon as a microbial or other biological agent or toxin, whatever its origin is, or equipment or means of delivery designed to use toxins in armed conflict. The UN defines a weapon of mass destruction as a class of weaponry with the potential to kill millions of people, to jeopardize the natural environment, and fundamentally alter the world and lives of future generations through their catastrophic effects. And to me, both of these things are true of our changing climate, not just the slightly invisible and vague idea that the planet will be hotter 100 years from now, but very, very concretely as poverty, understood as the way in which poverty impacts the livelihoods and lives of millions of people, the way inequality is exacerbated by climate change, and the way actual civil war is triggered by climate change. And I'm not just talking about in the future. It was as far back as the year 2007 in which the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon actually referred to Darfur as the first climate change conflict. Very concretely, you could see how water scarcity, which was caused by a change in rainfall patterns, was directly related to the conflict that occurred in. The biggest risks of our future have biological dimensions, and they are related to our ability to do biodefense by building the defenses of this planet up. Let's look at catastrophic war and conflict. There is a study by Marshall Burke that shows us that 1% of increase in temperature leads to a 4.5% increase in civil war in a country in the same year. But let's break down what that means, because it's one thing to look at a number, but what are these factors? Diminishing resources. In the year 2011, UNEP told us that conflicts across the Sahel region were linked to changing climatic conditions. When you put two communities in confrontation with each other because resources are declining, because water sources are polluted, or because there is competition over scarce natural systems, let's say those communities very concretely in many conflicts are cattle herders, then you are creating conditions ripe for conflict. At the intersection of a climate affected and extreme weather related affected vulnerable situation which already has low governance, you add to that the spark of an ethnic conflict, you add to that the spark of a leader who wants to go to war against another community or another nation for self-interest, you suddenly have conditions that are ripe for civil war, for international war. Conflict-related humanitarian needs are exacerbated by climate change and vice versa. So for example, if you have war raging in a country and populations have to flee bombed out cities, but there is also at the same time a scarcity of resources and water bodies are polluted, and agriculture is not sufficient to meet the food security needs of that particular humanitarian situation, it will be that much more difficult for these people who are already escaping conflict to emerge from the conditions of war if we haven't already accounted for a decline in ecosystems and we haven't accounted for climate change as a vector. Let's take the concrete example of Mali. The Red Cross actually told us the story of how in 2019, when grazing land became scarce due to flooding in a certain region of Mali, the pastoralists couldn't travel with their animals to far off areas because of the presence of armed groups, because of the presence of armed conflict, and so they remained close to water sources. And that brought them in conflict with the farmers and the fishermen who were already at these water sources. Their animals became weaker. They couldn't be sold at fair prices in the marketplace. And therefore, that really trapped them in a cycle of poverty, of exclusion, of deprivation, and of armed conflict. But let's put a more concrete number to this. There was a Stanford-led study last year that told us that up to 20% of armed conflicts over the last century were influenced by climate. And if we don't do enough to control temperature rises, and if in the next in a 4-degree warming scenario above pre-industrial levels, the influence of climate will increase 5 times, leading to a 26% increase in conflict risk. We've already seen the impact of the climate on our risks, or on our vulnerability to health, to global health, not just through the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not the first coronavirus in the human system. You also know that this is not the first contagious disease that has come to us from an unsustainable relationship with wildlife. In fact, studies have told us that 75% of new infectious diseases in human systems come from an unsustainable relationship with wildlife and with natural ecosystems. We saw countries that already suffered from air pollution found it so much harder because to deal with COVID-19, because their health systems were impacted by the presence of respiratory diseases in the population. Climate change has increased our vulnerability to a world of deprivation for people. The COVID-19 pandemic not only robbed the economy of $8 trillion, it threatened to push $150 trillion of people into poverty. It pushed economies around the world into recession. It put 1.5 billion children out of school, and it literally killed and made seriously ill millions of people. But you know what else kills people and makes people seriously ill? Are the human security impacts of climate change. Pandemic is one of them, but other than that, there is the livability of our cities that has been impacted by pollution. The livelihoods of communities have been impacted in different continents by the decline in resources. Our vulnerability to disaster has increased. There are extreme forest fires in places that have cool climates. And all of these things need to be considered security issues and human security issues. Poverty and inequality that are caused by environmental degradation, soil degradation, the lack of food security in countries need to be understood as killers because they cause poverty, they cause inequality, they often wreak far more destruction than civil war. And therefore, I'm here to argue to you that we must think of our future, the future of our security systems, in terms of an expanded definition of biodefense. Biodefense 2.0, preventing and stopping risks by fixing our planet. To do this, we are going to need a renewed international efforts. We are going to, as countries and people, redouble our commitments to international agreements like the Paris Agreement. We have to start understanding our planet as a defense system in the same way that we understand aircraft carriers as a defense system. We have to accelerate our efforts to cut emissions and control temperature rises. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has already told us we only have 10 years left to stop irreversible temperature rises, that we are at a tipping point. There are some studies that have put this timeline at 4 years. There's barely any time left. We need to start talking about human security as a national security issue by focusing on pandemic control, by focusing on extreme weather events before they occur. We need better development. We need to address the factors of multidimensional poverty that leave people more exposed to these global shocks when they occur, whether they are pandemics or whether they are an increase in temperature rises in the next few years. We also need to start writing climate policy into security policy. So for example, and this has been done to some extent, the Geneva Conventions have an additional protocol 1 that afford protection to the natural environment against damage from war. And we have to understand that in the way that we do security activities as well. And finally, we need to acknowledge our role across countries and sectors in the front lines of this fight for a greener, for a better and more secure and peaceful future. Because climate change and environmental issues are our next global security risk. And we can only move forward not just by doing siloed traditional security, but by understanding how much poverty, how much inequality, how much environmental degradation, hunger, the lack of resources that people have contribute to making our lives less secure. And when we do security systems and defense systems in the future, climate change policy must absolutely be part of that arsenal. Thank you.